Okay, so we're going to continue with our group therapy series. And in today's lesson, I'm going to talk to you about the working stage of group. As you may recall, that there are 4 general stages of group. We talked about the initial stage. We talked about the transition stage. The most immediate video I did before this, we talked about group dynamics and factors that are at play. Now let's talk about the working stage, which is the third of the 4 stages. All right, so let's start with our learning objectives. So the first learning objective is to appreciate the dynamics associated with group process and development, demonstrate some leader interventions for exploring fear at various stages of group. We'll identify key characteristics of the group during the working stage. We'll distinguish the difference between a working group versus a non-working group. We'll identify ethical and cultural relevant strategies for designing and facilitating groups. And then we'll continue with a discussion of choices that are made during the working stage, therapeutic factors that are at play and how they impact group effectiveness. We'll talk about self-disclosure from the member, self-disclosure from the leader, guidelines for giving and receiving feedback. And I talked about this briefly in an earlier lecture, the importance of compassionate criticism. And then we'll talk about identity, to identify issues with co-leaders during the working stage. So one thing that is important to start off with in principle is we talk about these 4 stages, but there's no arbitrary line between each phase. And when we talk about phases or stages, there has to be a transformative shift that happens in order to move from one stage to another, right? And some groups will make it to the working stage. Some groups may not reach the working stage, right? And the development of the group as a whole tends to ebb and flow, right? So it's dynamic, it's not static, it doesn't stay the same. So as I said earlier, work happens at every stage, not just a working stage. So I don't want you to think that working stage means now we're doing work. Remember when we talked about the goals of each stage, the goal of the initial stage is to establish trust. So that's the work that's being done. The transition stage is addressing risk-taking and the initial stages of conflict, right? So each stage has its own function, but not every group reaches the working stage, as I said. And even if the group as a whole is in a working stage, not every individual is at the same point at the same time. So we have to understand there are individual differences even when the group moves. So you have to be mindful where the group is and where the individual is. All right. But to reach the working stage, members must make a commitment to work through challenges and face issues and barriers that are interfering with the group's progress. So there has to be an openness for change. There has to be a willingness to receive criticism and work on any resistance or unwritten, agendas that a person has or hidden agendas that a person has. So it's important to commit that you're going to look at those. And I said work happens at every stage, but there is a deeper exploration of the self, deeper exploration of the functioning within the group. And this occurs as a function of the group coming together. So when you have group cohesion, then you could start to look deeper. So that closeness that you have with the other members of the group allows you to feel safe, allows you to receive criticism, and allows you to explore blind spots that you might have on a deeper level. So that's important. So interventions at each stage. One intervention we have at the initial stage is to provide encouragement. When we talk about the transition stage, the interventions demand more from the member than at the initial stage. So now the member has to be self-driven a little more. And then in the working stage, the entire group is working. The entire group is focusing on the member's personal work and vice versa. So you start by getting people to take risks and trust and share. Then they're self-governed. And then the group can put a spotlight on an individual. And last but not least, we encourage members to see how they change as a function of the group, right? So we look for transformation in the final stage. All right. So the group norms and behavior of the working stage. One norm is that we support and challenge members of the group. We encourage people to take risks. In terms of interventions, there's no singular intervention that you do. I will say that the lecture on theories and interventions was helpful because a lot of what we said comes back in this stage. There's definitely more interaction between the members. Members are more direct. Members are starting to challenge one another, and they're starting to focus on action-oriented behavior. All right, so we tend to see in a working group that there's a large amount of trust. That trust is established. Members' goals are clear and specific. They focus on the present. Now they're willing to make themselves known. Now, you may recall in a transition phase, we talked about people taking risks and putting their toe in the water. Now, they're no longer just putting their toe in the water, they're diving headfirst into the water, right? So they're making themselves known. And it came as a function of all the trust and risk-taking activities that occurred prior. Cohesion is close. Everyone feels a bond to one another. Wherever there's conflict, it's identified, recognized, and explored. Remember, we said in a transition stage that conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict can result in closeness, can result in intimacy. So at this point, the members of the group can identify conflict. They can healthily address conflict. They could explore the sources of conflict and so forth. All right. In terms of a non-working group, it's sort of the opposite mirror of it. So instead of having trust, there's mistrust in the group, there's unexpressed feelings, there's a focus more on others than oneself. People tend to hold back, and instead of addressing conflict, they're ignored or they're addressed in indirect ways. Now, what's interesting about this is, we said conflict can be a good thing, right? So ignoring conflict or avoiding conflict or trying to communicate or address conflict in indirect ways actually doesn't solve the problem. It creates an opportunity for there to be miscommunication or for people to misinterpret what you're trying to say. So all of these things have to be attended to in the working stage. So we have a choice, right? So there are decisions that people are making as members of the group. The first one is whether to share or not share, whether to self-disclose, or whether to remain anonymous, right? So when people speak up in a group, they're taking a risk. That requires a sense of trust. Whereas people who remain silent, they're keeping their views anonymous. They're not actually giving the group the experience, right? Authenticity versus guardedness, right? So being real and being raw as appropriate. That would be being authentic, versus being guarded would be holding back and not allowing the true self to come out. Being spontaneous versus regulated, right? Being spontaneous, you'll notice in initial stages, the group leader might call upon people, right? But by the working stage, people should just naturally chime in, naturally share, demonstrate a sense of spontaneity. Whereas people might, if they don't feel that there is trust, they might be more regulated or guarded, or I use guarded, but they might control their actions a little more. Acceptance versus rejection. One of the biggest questions in the initial stage is whether or not you're going to be accepted or rejected, right? So at this point, you're making a decision whether you feel part of the group and accepted. If you feel more accepted, you're going to be more likely to participate. If you feel rejected, you're going to be more likely to distance yourself from the group and not take risks. Unity versus fragmentation. Unity or cohesion is absolutely essential for the working stage, right? Where versus fragmentation, where people are working on their own agenda versus the collective goals of the group, that would be more fragmentation. All right. Now the group, in terms of homework, we talk about giving homework. The group is not an end of itself. It's actually a place, it's a laboratory. That's the best way to say it. It's a laboratory where you can try things out. You can learn new behaviors, you can learn new sets of skills. It's a training ground, whatever you want to say. But the work should happen in between groups. So if you use homework, you give people an opportunity to connect to what happened in group between groups, which means that instead of having 60 to 90 minutes with these individuals, now you're giving them the opportunity to think about the experiences of group 24/7. You're giving them the full range of experience. Members can design their or devise their own homework assignments, right? So when we talk about individual goals within a group setting, if you want to work on something, you say, well, what's one thing you might want to commit to this week? And then members might say, well, my goal is X. This week, I'm going to work on Y. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. In terms of what you settle in on, many times the homework is done in a collaborative way, which is not just the member themselves, but the leader is supposed to facilitate that or shape that or change it up if appropriate, or guide the homework process. So the leader also plays a role in helping form homework. In psychoeducational groups, it actually is more often the leader who gives the homework. All right, so in terms of therapeutic factors that operate in a group, we talked about self-disclosure, sharing about oneself. There are different levels of that. That's important, right? So people should share about themselves, offer feedback. So this is other members of the group offering feedback about their experience of another person. Confrontation, and again, an appropriate confrontation, as we emphasized in another lecture. Finding a sense of cohesion or universality. Hope, purpose. Now, these are a list you might have remembered you saw in the first lesson as well, but now you're starting to see them really at play and how they actually come. So people might come into a group very depressed and despondent, but as a function of the group process, they might feel more hopefulness, willing to take risks and trust, feeling accepted, feeling more empowered versus disempowered, feeling a catharsis, a release of whatever has been bothering them or plaguing them, working on their thoughts, focusing on a commitment to change, invite an invitation to experiment with who they want to be, not who they were in the past. And humor. Humor is important. I actually use humor all the time in session because I find that there's a natural tension that happens in all therapy processes. So using humor can release some of that tension. All right. So about self-disclosure, whenever you share, it should be related to the purposes of the group. It should help the group move forward. And those of you who've had the experiential part of the class, you've seen how group leaders can model self-disclosure in an appropriate way to get people talking, right? So self-disclosure is very important because it allows all the thoughts and feelings you're experiencing and that keep recurring to have an outlet, right? So your level of self-disclosure and that which you self-disclose, it depends on many things. Number one, the stage of the group might determine what's appropriate. So it's not uncommon for people to be very authentic in the initial stage, but in the working stage, people are going to share at a deeper level, right? And in terms of what you disclose, no one can make you share something you don't want to share. So what you disclose, how much you disclose is entirely up to you, right? But we know that if people feel safe in a group setting, they're going to be more likely to self-disclose, right? Because they feel that they're not under attack. So when you give feedback, right? So another thing is giving feedback to other people. Give honest feedback, right? So you don't benefit another person by not giving them real feedback. So if you see something in a person that's not okay, you can bring it to their attention, but you should do it with sensitivity. And you may recall in an earlier lesson when you're offering constructive criticism, there were principles at play, right? So make sure those principles are fulfilled. Make sure that the other people know how their behavior affects you, right? So speak from your point of view in a non-judgmental way, and try not to offer global feedback like you never do this, you always do that, or overgeneralizations in general are not going to be helpful. Catharsis, right? Catharsis is a release or an expression of pent-up emotions, right? So there are times in the group process where people are having an intense moment and they're at you might have two members of the group locking horns, but as a function of sharing their experience, they feel a release, they feel healing, right? And as a function of that, they feel closer to the person, even the person they were locking horns with. So you can have a catharsis or release by being authentic, by sharing your emotions, releasing them. Now, be careful with how deeply you dive into emotions, because you have to be able to repackage the experience, right? So maybe that deep emotional experience wouldn't be appropriate for a parenting group, let's say. I don't know. Actually, I can see reasons why it might be appropriate for a parenting group, but there might be settings where that deep expression of emotions, you may not want to go that deep. All right. What happens after the cathartic event? Well, first, you want to link the emotions with their thoughts and behavior. So if they had this insight, this incredible self-discovery or release, we ask them, what are you thinking right now? What are you feeling? How might you take this and put it into action when it comes to behavior? So we link the emotions with thoughts and behaviors. And absolutely, it's important to link that catharsis with some kind of behavioral outcome or action plan going forward. When we talk about co-leading a group in a working stage, between group sessions, you're supposed to discuss the reaction to group members, see how each one's interacting with one another and how you can help participants better understand themselves, better understand their behavior within the group, and resolve some of their conflict, right? So you also use an opportunity to evaluate how the group is going and how it's going as a group co-leader, right? So how are we doing as facilitators? And then, we evaluate orientation styles, self-disclosure, and so forth. You talk about the next step, right? Interventions we might use. Now, the member function. What should members be experiencing at the working stage? Well, they should come into group ready to talk. They should come into group ready to share experiences that they want to bring up or issues that they want to bring up. They should be committed to offering feedback to another person. And if they're receiving feedback, they should be committed to an open-mindedness to whatever feedback they're doing. They should be willing to take risks. They should be willing to practice new skills and interventions in their daily life. And they should be willing to evaluate how they're feeling with the group experience and their relative satisfaction with the group. Now, leader function, your job as a leader is to model appropriate behavior. We've been saying this from the initial stage, or continue to model self-disclosure and appropriate behavior. If people are trying to take risks, you want to support people's willingness to take risks and encourage people to get a little bit beyond their comfort zone. And then if they do take a risk, you want to help them turn it into some action, right? You also want to, there are going to be times when you want to do a deeper dive on the person, further self-exploration, right? So in the event that you see someone is stuck or about to have a catharsis, you might do a deeper sense. You might look for common themes across members of the group to provide some universality. I like to use the phrase, can anyone join this person with this experience? Has anyone had a similar experience, right? And with that, you're identifying universality. And then, you're promoting behaviors that will increase cohesion as a function of decreased cohesion. So that is a very quick rundown of the lesson. So I'm going to stop there. And until next time, everybody.